everyone, and welcome to the 10th in our series of commentaries on the crisis, in which we're intending to bring insight into the way businesses are changing, the stages of that change affected by the global pandemic, how we can recognize these stages, and how we need to be reacting as HR and finance professionals. So kind of what signs are we looking for, how we should be reacting and working with the crisis continues. We'll be focusing more and more on the replanning stage at the moment. Previously, we talked a lot about the early stage and the original impact, but all our businesses are now talking about replanning. The reopening of retail stores, which is imminent in the UK and globally, is absolutely happening, I believe, next week. But my guest, and I'm delighted to welcome Bola Ogun, who is Global VP and Reward for Natura, who are a global, Natura Co, who are a collection of global beauty and health brands. I'm sure I've got that wrong, Bola, but you can explain more, which include Body Shop, Aesop, Avon, recent acquisition, I believe, and Natura, which is a huge brand in South America and other parts of the world. So, Bola, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're really excited to talk to you.
Tom, it's great to be with you, and thank you very much to the team for inviting me. I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Brilliant, good. Because to some extent, I think that Natura is kind of in the eye of the storm. You've got with a combination of retail, a combination of social selling, a combination of presumably complex supply chain, all this kind of stuff, and a global base. I'm really excited to talk to you two as well, Bola, because previously we've had UK retail represented. We've had government represented. We've had some global businesses, but I think your story and Natura's story is going to be very exciting.
Definitely, because Natura and Co, we are in approximately 60 plus countries globally. We have a workforce in excess of 35,000. And as you said, the model, so maybe it might be helpful for me to just give a little bit of background for those that don't know. Natura is a collection of businesses, but we would say businesses which are united by a common purpose. And that common purpose is around beauty, but beauty for a difference, and beauty with a social conscious. So we have Aesop, which heralds its origins are from Australia, very upmarket boutique brand. Many people have heard of it. Avon, which is an iconic brand. Many people's parents and so on may have been involved in Avon in the 70s, 80s. But what's interesting is there are still over 5 million Avon sales reps out there. So still very much relevant today. In addition to that, we obviously have TBS, which for us in the UK, the Body Shop is an iconic brand. And all of those brands together with Natura, which is a Latin American brand heralding from Brazil, where its commitment has been very much to the environment, to Amazonia, sustainable sourcing of its products. So brands which touch many different parts of the world.
So did you say 5 million people in the Avon family?
There are over, yes, so we refer in Natura Co to either consultants or representatives. These are people which we would know more as kind of gig economy employees. But if you think about it, companies such as Avon have been doing that for over 130 years. So Avon was making those earning opportunities, independent earning opportunities for women, for example, in the US, which is on many people's minds, before there were the rights to vote. So for over 130 years, of that relationship in a gig economy style, where they are able to purchase the products from the company and then sell them on to their networks and so on terms that work with them, and advising them on beauty, personal wellness, and so on.
So I'm assuming that, I talk about this in if I kick off a little bit about the anatomy, I'm going to cover what we are going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about. We're going to try and avoid talking about the personal psychology of the crisis, but focus on the business psychology. So the business impact, how it affects colleagues and friends, but not direct. There are many other commentators who talk more directly about the personal impact on us individually, etc. And we'll leave them to do that. I'm more interested in the business impact and how that works and the business psychological stages we're going through. The second thing which is worth noting is we're going to try and cover the crisis in its fullness. So, there are three kind of stages to this kind of crisis, which we've talked about a little bit in our view. The first of those is the kind of chaotic reactive stage, one which now is historical for many of our businesses, but, the shock of having to close down our businesses and then trying to restart those businesses in a very different way. And that kind of reactive, chaotic stage was characteristic of, let's say, the first 8 to 12 weeks of the lockdown, the global lockdown. The second part, which is about the replanning, the re-envisaging, reimagining our businesses for the future, which I guess many of us believe is going to be very different, and we'll come on to that section because I don't think anybody believes that the economic position, the position of our consumers or our customers, etc., and the way we're going to work is going to be the same. But we'll talk about that later. And then finally, there's the new reality stage where we move out of this and come back to something which semblances the new business as usual. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the call. Thank you all for coming. And I'd like to kick off a little bit with that, Bola. In fact, you've already told us about your kind of network, but I imagine your enormous network, there's 5 million people plus all the other teams, the very complicated geographical position. I mean, you guys have a responsibility for an enormous number of people. How were they impacted? How did you kind of break it down, and how did you support them during that original kind of reactive stage?
Yeah. And I guess, Tom, the first thing to kind of say there is really that for many parts of the world, thinking particularly about those in South America and Brazil, we're hearing a lot about the impact of coronavirus there. And in the US, we have parts of the world which are still in the eye of that storm, where the infections and death rates and that kind of dark cloud is still very much over them, whereas we have other parts of the world, a bit like, the way in which the sun rises and sets in different parts of the world. We have other parts of the world which are much more out of it.
Yes.
You're right. For us, I should just clarify, with our consultants and representatives, they're very much part of the Natura & Co family. They're not our direct employees, so we do have a big concern for them, in the same way as businesses also have a concern for their customers, for those in their supply chains and so on. I think for us, I would say my reflection is it wasn't as chaotic as for some businesses, because being global, if we think this crisis started in Asia at the start of the year, and so some businesses started to get insights as to what was happening there in those early months in January and February, and were able to start at least thinking or starting to try and comprehend how you start to address it. So I think for all businesses, for HR teams in particular, for families, it's been phenomenal. And it's difficult to look back on it now and say, how did we handle it? But I think being able to see the waves of it occurring in Asia earlier, were able to give us that indication, particularly as we started to see some of the stuff in Italy and in Western Europe, that it was going to come and it was going to hit all parts of the world over time. I remember just...
And I imagine...
Sorry, Tom.
Well, I mean, that's fascinating because I guess as a truly global business, there are lots of businesses who are small offices in different countries, etc. But you guys are major retailers through that network and that message in all of the countries you've mentioned. So, that almost gives you, or has given your company, a unique perspective on seeing that roll out and then learning from one territory and applying it to the next territory. Even government.
It definitely did, because you saw situations, for example, in Australia or in some of the countries like the Philippines and places like that, where governments started to impose quarantines or lockdowns earlier. It was a really early indication of, okay, how are we going to cope with this here? But also, what are the potential implications in other jurisdictions? So I think it's one of the benefits of being global, that you have that reach. Although the other thing about coronavirus, which we have to be clear, it's impacted countries differently depending on the strength of their health systems, depending on their infection rates, depending on their approaches to their governments. We've seen things such as in Sweden, for example, some contrast within the Nordic countries where some governments didn't even go for shutdowns and sought to manage it in different ways.
I mean, a large part of your business model is social selling, as I understand it. So, I think about that as the kind of traditional party where a friend invites their friends and connections. I imagine it's much more sophisticated than that these days. But that social selling must have been impacted very significantly, because presumably in many jurisdictions that's not been possible in the way people are used to it.
Yep. Natura is an interesting collection in that respect, in that we have two very strong retailers in Aesop and in the Body Shop. And obviously there you saw situations where stores, we have nearly 3,000 stores globally. We saw situations where some of those stores or the shopping malls in which they were housed were closed, so you have a direct impact there. You also have the impact, as you said, through the social selling, that with the Avon representatives and the Natura consultants globally, and even things like TBS at home, where they have a similar model. You had situations where it became, unsafe for those individuals to be going out and to be visiting their customers directly. So some of it is that direct face-to-face personal relationship, but some of it with social selling has always been done through platforms, whether that's sharing a WhatsApp brochure or a WhatsApp message with somebody about some key product which they may be interested in, or a deal that has come up. So what it has driven, and I think it's not particularly unique to Natura & Co, to many businesses, much more online, much more of that virtual. I think we've all learned as businesses and personally just how much more you can do online, which we would have traditionally maybe have done face-to-face, whether that's keeping in contact with families, Zoom, MS Teams, and all of those platforms. House Party have kind of taken off and people are connecting in that way. So the connections are still there, but they're being done, I think, in a different format.
Right, and presumably by representatives and colleagues who aren't direct employees. So you haven't been able to directly tell them how to do this, but presumably support them in that move, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. And some of it is, if we think about it, you have some generations of individuals who traditionally who might, meet up in a social setting, others, young people whose primary way of connecting with friends and so on is via kind of social networks, via WhatsApps, via Snapchat, via all of those kind of social channels. So some of it is, in kind of business parlance, is this whole concept of omni-channel, and saying whether it's direct via retail, whether it's person to person, or whether it's via the web, and those platforms, of making sure that those were robust. Some of it is providing people with extra kind of training and support around that so that they can do that. I think many businesses have seen, strong spikes in their online connections with customer, online sales, and so on. And one of the questions which I think people are being asked is, is this really the new normal? Or hopefully, when the world is past this pandemic, will things go back to a more traditional face-to-face? And I think it's difficult to call, but I think most people will say we'll be somewhere in the middle. So
yes,
with the consultants and so on, it's been really, we've been really concerned, obviously, about them, as all businesses are, about their customers, about their network, to ensure that where we can provide any support to them, we're able to do that. But particularly given the nature of our products, a lot of our products are beauty, or personal care, soaps, hand sanitizers, etc., etc. Some of the things which have been in greatest demand during the pandemic, and whether it's been donating those to frontline workers, doing things like personal care packs, a bit of beauty pampering for people working in our healthcare systems, who have been, the absolute heroes of this. This type of thing has been the kind of thing which the business has been doing, as well as the normal BAU.
And that's really interesting, because you kind of touched on something which I think is fascinating, which is that the consultants themselves, that you've got a fracturing in the ability to go to market, changes to the market which have been different in different territories. But at the same time, I'm assuming that demand has been incredibly strong, because these kind of products are kind of go-to products in times of crisis, etc.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And some of it with, the days of the consultants or representatives, popping orders round to each person, that still occurs in some places, because that's where the social connections can be made, and there's nothing quite like, having a coffee or a drink with somebody and talking through some of the local trends and so on. So those aspects of it have been constrained, but the ability to connect virtually, person places an order, have that order delivered to their house, is still, very much there. Although I think we've all noticed the way in which deliveries are received now is a bit different, rather than the delivery person being on your doorstep and maybe even having a conversation or whatever. They kind of put the parcel on the doorstep or wherever and stand a social distance away and make sure it's been collected. So it has very much changed, and it's been different in different places. In some places, some of those stores have stayed open, but then the challenge has been our customers kind of coming out and visiting them in the same types of numbers. And as you said, as we start to kind of reopen, it's then planning how you do that. You've got different countries approaching those things in different ways. The use of masks, personal protective equipment, all of those types of things are sometimes culturally driven by what's appropriate in different markets, what governments are requiring. I was going to say it's a fascinating challenge, but given the nature of it, I think it's one that everybody would prefer not to be facing.
But as an HR professional, I think that's absolutely fascinating, because you basically, as you said, government rules are different from country to country, both in terms of their opening, etc., but also in terms of government support. So I'm kind of imagining that, you know, in the UK, we're all used to and have heard a lot about the furlough schemes and the other support we get from government, but presumably it's a bit of a patchwork that colleagues in other countries are possibly not supported in that way. So how much, Bola, are you bringing principles from Natura and applying those globally? And how much are you just taking a local jurisdiction position and applying that, if you see what I mean? So
yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think there you can have global principles like for us and like most businesses, protecting the health and welfare of our staff and our consultants and those colleagues who work more indirectly with us has been paramount. So even in situations like now where countries and places are opening up, there is very much a kind of cautious approach to that and saying, okay, just because the government or your city says that you can return to the office, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to. Let's make that in a very cautious way to make sure that we continue to protect you and others. And at the other end of it, when you think at that beginning where there was this shutdown and there were these questions about what government support is there, the shutdown impacts different things. So if you think about some of those people in warehouses and distribution and manufacturing, some of those continue to work, and they continue to work in most places. Sometimes there was an initial close, but once the government realized that the business was an essential business, or what it was going to focus on was the healthcare, the soaps and the sanitizer types of products, it then reopened. And so the question there was, how do you create that environment which is appropriate and safe? The deep cleaning, what's the best practice on that, and so on. But where people and businesses did need to close, the question of kind of furlough or support, it varies by countries. What's interesting sometimes though, I think from a HR perspective, is where you have teams. If I take, I think North America was one of the ones which struck me. So you have Canada and you have the US, you know, neighboring countries, some similarities, but where their governments took quite different perspectives on it in the degree of support which they gave. So then the question for the business is, in those situations, do you try and apply a one size fits all, or do you recognize that the governments are different? But for a manager of a team, it's much more challenging, because if you have half of your team who are maybe just receiving the government support, which is very low, and in another country the government support is higher, how do you square that? And I think most businesses have tried to have some principles of saying we want to protect all of our workers in terms of their pay as well as their health for a period of 60 or whatever period of days, and then we'll look at it beyond that.
And is that how you guys have approached it, to try and I mean, obviously you can't support 5 million people during a whole period entirely. You need government support, etc. So there's obviously a financial limiting to what you guys can do. But have you been trying to do that to kind of equalize some of these disparities where it's possible?
Well, we've done a few things. I think with our consultants and reps, again, who were not employees, our main aim there was, where possible, to continue to make sure that they have access to the products and so on, particularly the ones which their customers are really asking for, and to be able to keep those warehouses and the supply chain going in order to deliver that. For our employees, as I said, it was different for different groups because you had some groups who continued to work during the whole of this period. Outside of that, what we've tried to do as a business is make sure we've had some core principles of saying to people, we will continue to protect your salary where we can for a period of time. After that, it's then about accessing what is available in terms of the government support in your particular country. In some places, it's made sense to try and top up the government support to a degree, or things like the UK government is now doing, I think, is things which companies were really keen on, which was enabling people to potentially take some annual leave as well. So
yeah,
it's very fluid, and as you look at it across 50 or 60 countries, you know, it's mind-boggling even to kind of comprehend, and the rules often change. But I think from a global perspective, it's that principle of let's try to protect, let's make sure we're signaling to people as early as possible what's going to happen after the next 2 weeks or after the next month, so that they have time themselves to plan. So I think those are the key things which have been for us.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I hadn't really thought about that angle, that actually continuing to provide these people with the tools that to allow them, which is affect the supply chain of the products, is critical.
Yeah.
If they can keep their network going and they are able to keep on selling and supporting their customers, I guess it's Natura's responsibility to make sure they've got the tools to do that and the supply.
Yeah, and particularly some of those things which, you know, people have been, where they were going to shops where, you know, the shops were clean out of things like sanitizers and soaps and some of those core products, or just some of those things that in the height of a pandemic, it's about, you know, the mental and personal healthcare where, you know, you have a particular cream or an aftershave or something which just makes you feel better as you kind of battle with surviving it and running a home and looking after friends and family. So that's definitely been key, but it's very difficult. It's even things like, on your point about global principles, even things like personal protective equipment or mask wearing or temperature checking, which is many of the things which companies are looking at. Now, it's difficult to lay out global principles on them when each country is so different. So if you take somewhere like, you know, New Zealand and some countries where they have had almost zero cases of people testing positive for a significant period of time, does it make sense to insist that your staff in a store there are wearing masks and that you insist every customer that comes in wears a mask or washes their hands or etc.? Whereas in other countries, mask wearing is much more culturally acceptable. Testing of temperatures and so on at the doors of places is common. So it would almost be remiss not to do it. I think in countries like the UK and so on, we're starting to really be at the core of having, you know, those debates. I know, for example, my son went off to school, the eldest one, today, and he was insisting, you know, that he needed to have a mask. And we had a, you know, debate about it, and it was really saying, well, given he suffers from hay fever, it's probably a good idea for him to have a mask, because if he sneezes, other children might be concerned that he has something. If he's got a mask on, then the mask is actually protecting them. It's so different based on the different situations in different countries and at different times.
Yes, it all crosses our mind. I see somebody in a mask and I think, is that because they are cautious or is that because they are ill? It's a real, it is fascinating, the change in our attitude to that kind of personal protection. And I guess some countries are forcing a position which you guys don't necessarily agree with. And that must be very difficult.
I think with those you have, if you look at maybe the reopening, so the UK, with the government is encouraging people where it makes sense to go back to work, and so on. And I don't think it's so much that companies are disagreeing with it. I think companies are taking a sensible approach, which is almost to continue to say, where individuals can work remotely and where we've got used to doing that over recent months, then there's no need to rush back to the office, because in this type of situation, it makes sense to do it almost gradually, to have, whether it's a third, whether it's a quarter of your workers where they need to be because of the equipment they use or the teams that they're based in. Let those individuals go back first. It makes it easier to maintain the social distancing on public transport systems and in offices and all of those types of things. So I think that kind of, companies are being more potentially cautious initially, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because we all want to hope and ensure that the infection rates continue to go down and the health systems continue to get on top of it. So for us, it's involved a lot of dialogue and really saying to people, these are the range of options, and being able to respond to it. So personal protective equipment is a good one. Where it's needed, have it available. Let those individuals at the front line have that choice and feel comfortable that they are protected when needed.
Now, this is very interesting, I think, from an HR perspective. You just mentioned that where those people feel that they need it and that it's necessary, they should be able to do it. And this is a very different approach from what we've seen pre-COVID, where HR departments, etc., branding parts of businesses were very dictatorial. They would tell people exactly how to present themselves. They would explain how the store was going to be run, how people are presented and managed, etc. But what we're hearing from a lot of commentators, what I've been hearing from a lot of leaders, is that they are now much more open and need to listen to the situation on the ground and individual managers in stores and in different countries, etc., in a way in which is kind of completely new, because the only person who knows whether the Aesop branch in Shoreditch can be made safe are the two people who work there, and they need to be, to some extent, autonomous in a way which previously they wouldn't have been. And I think this is a fascinating trend from the crisis.
It is. I think in some spaces there are clear guidelines which you need to ensure are kind of followed. The things about if people exhibit symptoms, if they live in a household where somebody has symptoms, and so on, those things are absolutely key. There are some things about, how you may change the layout of a store or reduce the number of people coming in to make sure that those parts of it are managed. But some of the dialogue has to be around how vulnerable a person kind of feels within a store. Some of the debates are, on the one hand, you can have a store which you restrict to having only one salesperson working in order that there is nobody else around them in terms of colleagues who may infect them or anything like that. But on the other hand, there is a consequence to that in terms of their potential isolation. Do they feel safe working on their own? Should you have somebody on the door who's greeting customers, encouraging them to wash their hands, doing the temperature checks in markets where that's appropriate? So I think those things much more need to be done on a market by market situation. And also it depends sometimes on the physical layout. You used a great example with Shoreditch, where you've got some prime real estate or particular areas. The store may be designed in a particular way, or an office may be structured in a particular way that you can't get more than X number of people in there, or to do a one-way traffic is almost impossible if you have quite a narrow staircase in a warehouse style building. So those one size fits all, this is the template and the way it will work. It has to be much more dialogue at a kind of local level, and also being conscious that the situation can change, quite rapidly. Some of us saw the pictures on the TV of the business minister, in the House of Commons, speaking, sweating, and the question of, has he got COVID? It was interesting there, but they didn't seem to have any temperature testing or something, or would there have been something they could have done there to have identified that? And we may see today that they changed those rules within 24 hours of the House of Commons coming back from their break. So you have to be, I think, really agile, to use the parlance.
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, people have talked about changes to their business in kind of 5 weeks, which would otherwise have taken 5 years. But I think that some of the things we're talking about and some of the changes are actually really positive. I think this kind of localism and the ability of people to, or the need for us to allow our colleagues more autonomy, albeit setting the red lines, but a much narrower set of red lines than previously. I mean, we're all used to firms where managers tell people what to do. And actually, that kind of a change, I think, is fascinating. You're talking about consultants finding their own way to different new routes to market, to conversations with their customers and all this stuff. Yeah. And it's much less dictatorial than the world used to be. I wonder how much of that's going to stick and how much of it's going to be beneficial by that.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? You have this famous saying, which I think people are tired of hearing, of the new normal. And it will be really interesting to see in 6 months' time how much of this is really new normal. There were some things which I think people are generally saying will definitely be different. So the concept of remote working, whereas many countries, or I was talking to a friend in Paris yesterday. France is one of those countries which traditionally was a little skeptical more generally about kind of remote working and home working. You can imagine why. Are you sitting in the south of France on a beach or somewhere nice? Yes. Or, are you really stuck in a tiny apartment in the center of Paris working? So there are principles like that where I think everybody says this great experiment in remote working has demonstrated that people can work effectively remotely, and even more so. On the other hand, we have to be careful about that. We have situations where we know people in shared houses who, maybe their only personal space is their bedroom. Do you really want them in that room for 8 hours a day, hunched over a laptop, working on whatever it is? Or those types of things I think we're going to need to look at in more detail, but definitely I think remote working is something which will be very different than it was before. But this concept, will city centres enter empty of great office buildings and so on? I think many of us, grew up in a culture of getting dressed and going to the office and that social networking and so on, which you have there. I think for businesses, though, the move to online selling and that omni-channel approach is definitely something which has been reinforced. And I don't think it's necessarily an either or. It really means, if we look at it now, how many of us are just happy with connecting with our families over Zoom or WhatsApp or FaceTime or whatever? It does a job and it's good, but I think we would all say, and we want to still have much of that face-to-face contacts and meeting up with people. So I think we're going to see the kind of this omni-channel, multi-channel, retail, online, some face-to-face, almost combined.
That's very interesting. So what you guys have been kind of spearheading and leading through your brands on the customer and sales side is now going to be applied more in the back office and the way the office teams work. It kind of, you can almost see that reflection.
Yeah, well, for example, I lead a global team. I have some of my team are in Brazil, in the Natura office. We have people in New York, in London, etc. And even the team which is based in London, we have great connections via Teams or Google Hangout or whatever the platform is that people are using. You can work effectively in that way, but you miss some of that when you're trying to see how a colleague is. There's nothing quite like being able to see them face to
Yes.
face, you know, as you go to get a coffee or whatever, to see, you miss some of that spontaneity. Yeah, clearly, I think through these platforms, we listen more. I think you can hear more of the tonality in people's voices and so on. So there are benefits of both, but I don't see it as a kind of either or. Maybe teams like mine will be in the office once a week, once every couple of weeks maybe. But I think there is still, once it's safe and appropriate to do it, there will still be a benefit to doing some of that. And some of those relationships, I think once you've built a relationship, you can maintain it in a virtual world. So for our consultants, I think where they've built those relationships with some of their customers, keeping in contact with them with this way is great because they can cover much more people than they could in a previous
Yes.
approach of in person. But I don't think it will be, you know, we're not going to just move to a virtual world, would be my personal prediction.
I am quite liking the word you used of remote working, and I think that some of us have kind of slipped into this slightly lazy way of words of kind of working from home, and it's being used as a term. I work from home or work in the office, but actually the kind of term remote working is more inclusive than that. So if a person, you know, cannot work from home but is working from a local office, which is maybe not your office or a different space, I think that we need to think about this as a tool.
Or a friend's house. It could be, you know, it could be their parents' home. It could be, you know, a neighbor's home. They could be, you know, doing a bit of whatever, dog walking or something for the neighbors, and that person may have a more appropriate space. So I think it really, the working remotely phrase just concentrates from working remotely from where they have traditionally worked or where you may expect them to work. And we know that can often be more effective. It's always, you've had those situations where somebody's had a project or something to concentrate on, and they don't want that interruption of the spontaneous people coming in and out. So they've taken themselves off, maybe even to a different part of the building or somewhere to go and work. So I think that's something which I think we will see, we'll see more of.
And I think that's really interesting because then colleagues become a different definition, because, you know, we all think of our colleagues as the people who are jointly employed by the same company who are working on the same or similar exercise to us. But actually, is that what colleagues are? Or are colleagues actually people who share a workspace with us and who are also working to a kind of similar rhythm? And I think that's a really interesting progression. I mean, you know, we can't all get on the number 10 bus, right? And that's going to be a long time to get people to our offices. So I think, I wonder whether those definitions are going to change. But we've kind of used up most of our time, Bola. What I was going to do was ask Becky whether there are any questions and whether we can run through questions and our reflections generally before we come to a close. So Becky, what have we got in the list?
Yes, I've got a couple of questions that are quite practical. I think there are some reward and talent people on the line. So one person, and I think this came up when you started talking about remote working and people maybe having to work in their bedrooms, etc. Are you imagining changing your EVP, so your employee value proposition, or your benefit strategy to align with people working from home more, or to encourage employees to return to shops?
It's a really good question. So I think that there's two phases of this. One is during this period of transition, and I think many businesses are saying that that's either through to the end of the year or through to 9 months or whatever it is post the crisis, and how do we support individuals during that short-term period. And I think this is the period where we have to be, Tom, to your language, we have to be listening most to what is practical and appropriate for those individuals. So in terms of shops and stores, if those individuals have people in their family who are shielding or any of those sensitivities, I think employers are being particularly attuned to that. Whether it's an individual, some people who are more senior or more accustomed to work from home are probably already kitted out with an appropriate pace to sit and to work and so on. Other people may need little bits of equipment. Some businesses I know are letting people come to the office and collect their mouse and their keypad and the stand that they put their laptop on and those types of things. So some of it is that practical stuff. I think in the more longer term, this is where whether it's reimagining or that recontracting piece will occur, and that question of what is appropriate, what are the long-term lessons which we've learned from COVID and this remote working. And that's where I think the recontracting with people may occur, and companies may look at making more individuals more permanently remote based and say, rather than 9 to 5 you're in the office, you're only there once every 2 weeks, and this would be typically the day.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we did that yesterday, didn't we, Tom? We went into the office and started shipping our office chairs out to to people's houses, including Tom's, because this has all gone on for a bit longer than we expected. So yeah.
Yes, yeah, and I hate to think of equipment sitting here where it could be usefully used by where people are actually working. It's crazy. Now, what was the second question, Bex?
One more question, and this is around: do you envisage the annual performance and related bonus and pay review being different in this new reality?
It's a difficult one. If we start with the money question on bonuses, there is so much going on there. You have debates at one angle of should companies which have accessed government support, government furlough schemes and so on in countries, should they even be paying bonuses or long-term incentives? Some businesses, Natura CO is no different. Our board and our CEO took a decision to take a temporary reduction in pay. We offered leaders the opportunity to do that when many of them came forward and said they wanted to support in a way. So there's been many kinds of different pay actions which have occurred around this. I think you have, again, the difference of what will the impact be on this particular financial year. What we've only really seen at the moment is the impact on businesses in Q1. That period through to the end of March for many businesses. We'll need to see how businesses have been impacted in their annual performance when you get to Q2. Then it's the question of what happens in the final 6 months of the year. Do we see this kind of great return, and does everything get better and caught up in the last 6 months? So I think with bonuses, it's a difficult one to call, but clearly they're going to be impacted, and it's a question of just seeing how that pans out. It's a bit early to call. On performance, people have adjusted differently to this. I think most businesses have been really surprised at how employees have managed that challenge of potentially having children at home if they've got children. If they haven't got children, needing to try and pop out and check on an elderly relative or somebody in the street and so on. So I think there'll be a great recognition of how flexibly people have worked. But at the same time, and there may be some reimagining of performance objectives and so on. But I guess we also have to be conscious that these are businesses, and their overall business performance needs to be looked at when you come to taking those decisions about whether it's been a good year. Although somebody did say that we have to remember we've been trying to survive a pandemic and work. So not all of us have been able to learn Spanish or French or whatever as well as that.
Great, thank you. Thanks from everyone on the call as well.
Great. Well, look, thank you everybody for attending. That was really interesting. I learnt an enormous amount from what Bola was saying. Actually, my reflection is how many complicated questions remain to be answered, and how many of those reflect around fairness, around appropriateness, and really kind of reimagining how we apply those kind of principles. So Bola, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and that was a really insightful and fascinating conversation. So thank you very much.
No, Tom, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been great to connect with you guys. Take care.
Great, and thank you everyone else for taking time out of their morning. We are doing these events on a weekly basis, and we are also doing further ones on reimagining and reframing programs, which is and transformation activity. Our key push at the moment, our key thought at the moment is that the service HR needs to provide in the future needs to be very different, and therefore we need to reframe our activities. So that's another series of webinars which we're running. But again, thank you all for coming, and have a great day.